My name is Maisie Carter. I'm 38 years old, and until recently, I was the Chief Compliance Officer at a mid-sized financial technology firm in Chicago. Most people don't picture someone like me when they think about power. I'm not loud. I don't interrupt. I don't dominate a room with volume or charisma. I sit straight. I listen fully, and I take notes by hand. My wardrobe is predictable. Structured blazers, neutral tones, nothing that begs attention. If you had walked past me in the hallway, you might have mistaken me for someone's assistant. That was a mistake more than a few people made. What they didn't understand is that compliance is not about control. It's about memory. It's about patterns. It's about noticing what others hope no one is paying attention to. For 9 years, I built my reputation on being calm in rooms where tempers flared. I translated chaos into policy. I asked inconvenient questions without raising my voice. I believed in documentation more than debate. And I believed, naively perhaps, that integrity, once proven consistently, became unquestionable. I was wrong. This story begins the day I was accused of insider trading. Not privately, not gently, publicly, in a boardroom filled with people who had shaken my hand for nearly a decade. They said there were suspicious transactions. They said the timing was concerning. They said, "We're not drawing conclusions, but..." You can feel the rest of that sentence without anyone finishing it. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I didn't storm out. Instead, I did something that confused everyone in that room. I voluntarily handed over my personal bank records, every account, every transfer, every investment. No redactions. I watched their expressions shift from suspicion to discomfort to something else entirely. What followed was not dramatic. There were no slammed doors, no triumphant speeches, just an audit. A quiet, methodical audit. The audit cleared my name and uncovered suspicious trades from the CFO instead. But this is not a revenge story. It's about perception. About how easily competence can be mistaken for passivity. About what happens when the person you assume is the safest target turns out to be the most prepared. It's about silence, not as surrender, but as strategy. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you exactly how it unfolded. Not with exaggeration, not with bitterness, just the truth, as I experienced it. Because sometimes the most powerful move isn't defending yourself loudly. It's letting the facts speak in a room that underestimated your patience. Have you ever realized, a little too late, that someone had mistaken your calm for weakness? Before the accusation, before the audit, before anyone questioned my integrity, I was reliable, not brilliant, not visionary, not strategic, reliable. In corporate language, that word sounds like praise. In practice, it often means invisible. I was the one who stayed late to rewrite policy drafts so they would survive regulatory review. The one who reviewed footnotes in investor presentations to make sure no phrasing could be interpreted as forward-looking guidance. The one who flagged small inconsistencies before they became public problems. I wasn't invited to celebratory dinners when deals closed. I was invited when something needed to be cleaned up. The CEO would introduce me in meetings as Maisie. She keeps us out of jail. The room would laugh. I would smile politely. It was meant as a compliment. It always landed as a boundary. I sat at the edge of the boardroom table, not because anyone told me to, but because that's where compliance naturally falls, adjacent to power, never at the center of it. When strategy discussions grew bold, aggressive expansion, accelerated product launches, ambitious earnings targets, I would ask questions in a measured tone. Have we stress tested the regulatory exposure in that jurisdiction? Has legal reviewed the disclosure language? What's our contingency if the SEC flags this? The questions slowed the momentum. They were necessary. They were rarely welcome. Over time, I learned to compress them, to choose only the most critical concerns, to speak once, not 3 times, to accept that my value lay in containment, not applause. To them, I was cautious, risk averse, predictable. I dressed simply. I didn't share much about my personal life. I left office politics untouched. I didn't gossip. I didn't align myself with factions. I believed neutrality was professionalism. What I didn't see, at least not fully, was how neutrality can be interpreted as isolation. When new executives joined, they would test the room. Who held influence? Who controlled budgets? Who shaped the CEO's opinions? No one ever asked about compliance. They assumed I executed instructions. They didn't understand that I drafted half the policies that structured their authority. There were moments, small, forgettable to most, when I felt the outline of how they saw me. In one meeting, the CFO once said, "Let's let the adults discuss projections. We'll loop compliance in once we finalize the numbers." It was said casually, lightly. No one corrected him. I wrote it down in my notebook. Not because it hurt. Not exactly. Because it revealed something. I wasn't seen as strategic. I was seen as procedural. Useful, but peripheral. I carried that understanding quietly. When quarterly reports went out, I ensured every disclosure was airtight. When investor questions arrived, I crafted responses that protected the company from misinterpretation. When minor internal breaches occurred, I resolved them before they escalated. The board trusted that if Maisie signed off, the risk was minimal. Trust, I've learned, can be shallow. They trusted my work. They did not fully understand my mind. And so, when the allegation came, when they suggested that I, of all people, had leveraged insider knowledge for personal gain, it didn't just threaten my career. It revealed how little they had truly seen me. They had known my restraint. They had never considered my capacity. The accusation didn't begin in the boardroom. It began weeks earlier, in something so minor that anyone else might have dismissed it. We were preparing for an earnings release tied to a product acquisition. The acquisition itself wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the speed. Due diligence had been condensed. Legal review was tight. The projections were optimistic, aggressively so. I had flagged a disclosure phrasing issue in the draft press release. It wasn't dramatic. Just one sentence that implied guaranteed performance outcomes rather than forecasted ones. "I recommend we soften this language," I said during the executive review call. "If the integration timeline shifts, this phrasing could be interpreted as misleading." There was a pause. Then the CFO, Daniel Reeves, laughed lightly. "Maisie, if we filtered every sentence through worst-case hypotheticals, we'd never publish anything." A few people smiled. I didn't. "It's not worst case," I replied calmly. "It's standard exposure mitigation." He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Duly noted. We'll consider it." We didn't change the sentence. It went out as written. 2 weeks later, the stock rose sharply after a favorable analyst report that leaned heavily on that same language. I remember sitting at my desk watching the ticker, not with excitement, but with tension. Rapid growth isn't inherently suspicious. But rapid growth built on optimistic phrasing carries weight. The first small cut came the following Monday. Daniel stopped by my office unannounced. That alone was unusual. He rarely initiated one-on-one conversations with me unless something required a formal sign-off. He closed the door. "Quick question," he said casually. "Did you make any personal trades recently?" I looked up from my notebook. "I have a diversified portfolio managed through an external advisor." "Why?" "Just housekeeping," he said. "We're doing routine monitoring around blackout periods." That wasn't technically untrue. But compliance monitored executive trades, not my own. And I had not executed anything personally. My investments were on automatic rebalancing. "I haven't placed discretionary trades," I answered. "You're welcome to review the statements." He waved his hand. "No, no, not necessary. Just tightening processes." He left as quickly as he'd entered. I wrote the conversation down, not because it felt threatening, because it felt misplaced. The next small cut came in the form of omission. An executive strategy meeting was scheduled regarding post-acquisition restructuring. Normally, compliance would attend any discussion tied to material financial impact. My calendar invitation never arrived. I found out about the meeting from a junior analyst who mistakenly forwarded me a summary email asking for documentation. I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I walked down the hall and gently asked Daniel's assistant if the invite had been sent in error. "Oh," she said, glancing at her screen. "It was marked finance only." Finance only. Compliance is excluded from a restructuring discussion with projected market implications. I returned to my office and closed the door. There is a specific feeling when you realize something has shifted, but you don't yet know in which direction. It's not fear, it's recalibration. Over the next week, small irregularities accumulated. A compliance report I submitted received no acknowledgement. A data request I made to finance was delayed without explanation. A regulatory inquiry that would normally route through me was answered directly by Daniel's team first. Each instance, on its own, could be dismissed as a busy schedule. Together, they formed a pattern. The first true cut came in an email. "Maisie," Daniel wrote, copying legal counsel and the CEO. "We've identified potentially concerning trade timing tied to restricted information access. We need to discuss immediately." No details, no specifics, just potentially concerning. I stared at the screen. My first instinct was confusion. My second was clarity. Someone had already framed the narrative, the subtle distancing, the exclusion from meetings, the sudden housekeeping question about my trades. This wasn't spontaneous, it was positioning. And what struck me most wasn't anger, it was disappointing. Not because they were questioning me, but because they had done so quietly, building a case in rooms I wasn't invited to. That was the first small cut. Not the accusation itself, the silence before it. When people describe betrayal, they often focus on the moment of impact. But most betrayals don't begin with explosions. They begin with adjustments. After Daniel's email, there was no dramatic confrontation. Instead, there were meetings labeled clarification. There were carefully worded phrases, just reviewing procedures, standard review, nothing personal. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I was repositioned. In the first meeting after the email, I noticed the seating arrangement had shifted. Legal sat closer to Daniel. I was at the end of the table, near the wall screen. The CEO avoided eye contact at first, busying himself with printed packets. "Maisie," Daniel began, voice measured. "We've identified trades executed within 48 hours of the acquisition announcement. Given your access to pre-release information, we need to understand the timing." The implication hung there. I kept my voice steady. What trades? He slid a printed statement across the table. The company's stock, purchased through my brokerage account. The date was accurate. The transaction was real. But it wasn't discretionary. It was an automatic quarterly allocation triggered by my advisor's preset diversification schedule, a schedule that had been established years earlier. I explained this calmly. Daniel nodded. We understand that's your position. Your position. As though this were an argument, not a verifiable fact. Legal asked for documentation of the automated schedule. I agreed to provide it immediately. The CEO finally looked up and said, This is just precautionary, Maisie. We have to be thorough. Of course, thoroughness was my language. And yet, something had shifted. Not in what was being asked, but in how. Over the next 2 weeks, the tone subtly hardened. Emails that once began with, Can you advise? Now begin with, Please explain. Requests for documentation carried CCs to the board audit committee. I complied with everything, every statement, every advisor's communication, every time-stamped instruction authorizes automatic rebalancing. I didn't resist, and that, I think, was what they expected. Because compliance professionals are conditioned to accept scrutiny. We audit others. We must withstand audits ourselves. I reminded myself of that. If your processes are clean, transparency protects you. But beneath that rationalization was something else I didn't want to name. I had normalized being second-guessed. For years, I had accepted small dismissals as cultural friction. Jokes about being the fun police, side comments about slowing momentum, exclusion from strategy dinners because it's mostly numbers talk. Each time I told myself it wasn't personal. Each time I adjusted. When Daniel had once interrupted me mid-sentence to say, Let's not overcomplicate it, I didn't finish the point. When a junior associate deferred to him instead of me in a compliance matter, I didn't correct the hierarchy. When I wasn't included in early acquisition conversations, I told myself it was efficiency. You can rationalize almost anything when you believe in the larger mission. I believed in protecting the company, so I absorbed the friction. What I failed to recognize was that absorption creates precedent. By staying composed, I had become predictable. By not reacting, I had signaled tolerance, and tolerance, over time, becomes permission. The accusation wasn't born in a vacuum. It was incubated in an environment where questioning my judgment felt easier than questioning someone else's. Because I wouldn't fight loudly, because I wouldn't politicize, because I would respond with documentation instead of outrage. One evening, after sending my third batch of requested records, I sat alone in my office long after most of the lights had gone dark. I opened my black notebook and flipped back through months of entries, dates, comments, exclusions, subtle shifts in tone, patterns. Compliance trains you to look for anomalies in financial flows. I was starting to see anomalies in behavior, not proof, but direction. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. Had I mistaken restraint for safety? And if so, who had benefited from that mistake? There is a moment in every professional life when you realize the role you're performing is not the role you chose. It's the one others assigned to you. I didn't notice it all at once. It revealed itself in fragments, like reading a script and realizing you've been cast as a supporting character in a story that affects your own fate. In the weeks following the allegation, I observed something unsettling. No one expressed outrage on my behalf. No one said, This doesn't make sense. Instead, the tone was procedural, detached. Let's let the review run its course. We have to protect the company. It's unfortunate, but necessary. I had spent nearly a decade protecting the company. Yet now, I was positioned as a potential liability to it. That was the role, the responsible one. the rule enforcer, the person who would understand. In one audit committee prep call, a board member said, Maisie, you of all people know how these optics work. You can appreciate why we can't make exceptions. Exceptions, as if fairness were an indulgence. I responded evenly. I'm not asking for exceptions. I'm asking for clarity. Silence followed. Then the conversation moved on. That was when I understood. They expected me to absorb this quietly, to cooperate, to provide documentation, to endure the discomfort because I was the adult in the room. I had built a reputation for composure. Now that composure was being leveraged against me. Daniel, meanwhile, remained unshaken, confident, present in every strategic discussion. His voice was unchanged in tone. If anything, he appeared more authoritative. He would preface statements with, in light of recent compliance sensitivities, as though I were a footnote to be managed. I noticed something else. The narrative being shaped wasn't overtly accusatory. It was suggestive. We're not saying misconduct occurred. We're simply examining timing. Access plus transaction equals review. It was clever. No one had to call me guilty. They only had to repeat the formula enough times that the association settled. And I, by continuing to respond calmly, was fulfilling my assigned part. The contained suspect. I began to see the symmetry. For years, I had been the person who documented irregularities in others' behavior, who asked for explanations without emotion, who insisted that process mattered more than perception. Now, the same structure was being applied to me. But something felt misaligned. The scrutiny directed at my automated trade was thorough, almost eager. Yet, I knew with certainty that executive trading by senior leadership had historically been reviewed with far less intensity. I had signed off on blackout windows myself. I knew who traded and when. A thought surfaced that I resisted at first, not defensively, analytically. Why was my single, automatic allocation treated as anomalous when significantly larger discretionary trades had occurred around the same acquisition window? I didn't voice this question. Not yet. Instead, I continued playing the role they expected. Cooperative, precise, controlled. But inside, something had shifted. Not anger, not fear, recognition. They believed I would remain procedural, that I would focus solely on clearing my name and then return to my corner of the boardroom table. They had mistaken my professionalism for limitation. They had assigned me the role of the compliant participant in my own scrutiny. What they didn't realize was that compliance professionals are trained in something far more powerful than defense. We are trained in pattern recognition, and once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. That was the moment I stopped thinking of myself as the subject of an inquiry and started considering the possibility that I was observing one. Quietly, from the inside. The shift didn't happen in the boardroom. It happened on a Tuesday morning at 6:10 a.m. in my kitchen. I was standing barefoot on cold tile, waiting for the kettle to boil, staring at my reflection in the darkened window. Chicago was still quiet. No emails yet, no calls, no carefully neutral voices asking me to clarify. Just silence. For weeks, I had been responding, providing, explaining, documenting. I had been focused on disproving an implication. But that morning, a different question surfaced. One that compliance training had wired into me years ago. If this were happening to someone else, what would I examine? Not emotionally, structurally. I set my coffee down and opened my laptop at the kitchen table. I pulled up internal trading logs, not as an act of rebellion, but as part of my authorized oversight role. As Chief Compliance Officer, I had legitimate access to executive trade disclosures, blackout certifications, and pre-clearance records. I had avoided reviewing them during my own inquiry. It felt defensive, reactive. But now, I approached them the way I would approach any anomaly report: detached, methodical. The acquisition timeline sat in one column, pre announcement access lists in another, trade disclosures in a third. At first, nothing jumped out. Just numbers, dates, familiar formatting. Then I widened the window. Instead of focusing on the 48 hours before the announcement, the narrow frame they had applied to me, I expanded it to 30 days. Patterns don't always live at the point of accusation. They live in the lead up. And there it was. A series of trades executed by Daniel, not enormous, not reckless, strategic, incremental purchases in a supplier company that would directly benefit from our acquisition. Timed 3 weeks before the deal was public. Pre-cleared, yes, but justified under long-term portfolio diversification. The language was technically compliant, but the timing was elegant, too elegant. I leaned back in my chair. I wasn't looking at proof of misconduct. I was looking at asymmetry. My automated allocation, triggered by a preset algorithm, had been scrutinized within a 48-hour lens. His discretionary trades, strategically positioned within a broader window, had passed without comparable examination. The kettle clicked off in the background, and something inside me stilled. This wasn't about retaliation. It wasn't even about suspicion. It was about standards. If the company was going to apply microscopic scrutiny, it had to be applied consistently. And if it wasn't, why? I felt no surge of triumph, no adrenaline, only clarity. For the first time since the accusation, I stopped feeling cornered because I realized something essential. I was not powerless. I had access. I had knowledge. I had historical data. And I had something they had forgotten about me: patience. That morning, I didn't print anything. I didn't forward emails. I didn't confront anyone. I simply began building a parallel file, documenting timelines, cross-referencing access logs, reviewing pre-clearance justifications from the past year. If there was nothing there, I would accept that. If there was something, I would know, and I would decide, carefully, what to do with that knowledge. The shift wasn't loud. It was internal. I was no longer focused solely on defending my integrity. I was evaluating the integrity of the process itself. And that is a very different posture. By 8:30 a.m., I was dressed in my charcoal blazer, my black leather notebook tucked under my arm. When I walked into the office that morning, nothing outward had changed. But inside, I had stopped reacting. I had started observing. After that Tuesday morning, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reflexive, professional composure, the kind that absorbs friction to preserve stability. Now it was intentional. There's a difference. In meetings, I spoke less than ever. But not because I felt diminished. Because I was listening for alignment. Who echoed Daniel's framing? Who hesitated before agreeing? Who avoided eye contact when my name surfaced? People reveal more when they think you've retreated. During one executive session, the CEO summarized the ongoing review. We're cooperating fully with the external auditors. No conclusions yet. Daniel added, we just need to ensure all compliance layers are airtight, especially given recent sensitivities. Recent sensitivities. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. A few heads turned slightly in my direction. Brief glances, not accusatory, just curious. I nodded once, as if acknowledging a weather report. No correction, no visible reaction. Later that afternoon, legal requested additional clarification regarding the automated trading schedule. The tone of the email was almost apologetic this time. We know you've already provided documentation, but the auditors would appreciate a summary narrative in your own words. I wrote it, clear, factual, structured. I attached the original advisory agreement, time-stamped portfolio allocation rules, and email confirmations dating back 3 years. Then I did something different. I copied the audit committee chair directly, something I had never done without routing through Daniel first. Not confrontationally, simply transparently. The email read, "For completeness, attaching prior documentation referenced. Please let me know if any additional clarification would be helpful." No commentary, no subtext, but silence, when directed upward instead of inward, carries weight. Over the next week, I noticed subtle shift. Daniel began looping me back into meetings I had previously been excluded from. His tone softened slightly when addressing me publicly. "Maisie, from a compliance standpoint, are we comfortable with this structure?" Comfortable. It was the first time in weeks he had asked for my opinion without framing it as a liability. I answered precisely. No more, no less. Silence, I realized, unsettles people when they expect defensiveness. They had anticipated either indignation or anxiety. Instead, they received stillness. Stillness forces projection. I also began requesting information, carefully, within the scope of my role. Can finance provide the pre-clearance rationale summaries for Q2 executive trades? Please confirm blackout certification acknowledgements for all officers tied to the acquisition timeline. These were standard compliance requests, but I hadn't made them in months. Not with this level of granularity. Each request was neutral, each one documented, each one was sent through official channels. Daniel responded promptly, perhaps too promptly. "Of course, happy to provide." His language was polished, cooperative, but cooperation under observation feels different than cooperation in comfort. One evening, as I reviewed the expanded trade logs again, I noticed something else. Two of Daniel's incremental purchases had occurred within hours of closed-door acquisition modeling sessions. Sessions that included only 3 executives. He had disclosed them, he had pre-cleared them, but the rationale summaries were unusually vague. Strategic long-term position. No mention of supplier dependency forecasts. No reference to projected revenue uplift. Technically compliant. Strategically convenient. I didn't draw conclusions. I documented alignment. Silence at this stage wasn't about withholding. It was about sequencing. There is power in not announcing what you see, because once you speak, others adjust. As long as I remained composed, cooperative, and seemingly singularly focused on clearing my name, the broader environment remained unguarded. They believed I was defending. They did not yet understand that I was evaluating. And that distinction between defense and assessment is where quiet dominance begins. I wasn't waiting for vindication anymore. I was deciding what fairness required and when. Preparation rarely looks dramatic. It looks like routine. That was the advantage. No one questioned why the chief compliance officer was reviewing trade logs more closely. No one found it unusual that I re-examined blackout certifications or refreshed disclosure protocols. If anything, my increased diligence reinforced the narrative that I was being appropriately responsive to scrutiny. They didn't notice that my review had expanded beyond my own file. I created a separate framework on my secure drive. Nothing unauthorized, nothing extracted improperly. Simply a structured analysis of data I already had the right to access. Column 1. Access to material non-public information. Column 2. Trade execution timing. Column 3. Pre-clearance justification language. Column 4. Historical precedent. How similar trades had been reviewed in prior years. Patterns reveal themselves when you zoom out. Daniel's trades, isolated, appeared compliant. But when placed against historical scrutiny, standards applied to other executives, inconsistencies emerged. 3 years earlier, a vice president had been flagged for executing a much smaller trade 5 days before a minor product announcement. The internal memo at the time had recommended a written warning and enhanced monitoring. Daniel's trades, larger in size, tied to a materially significant acquisition, had generated no comparable internal memo. Not because they were illegal, because they were normalized. I reread the prior memo carefully. I had drafted it myself. The language was firm, procedural, precise. It struck me that the standard I had enforced rigorously for others had never been tested upward. That realization wasn't bitter. It was clarifying. Over the next week, I requested archived audit committee minutes. Again, within my authority. I was looking for precedent language. How concerns had been escalated. What thresholds triggered an independent review? No one asked why. I also scheduled a brief call with our external regulatory counsel under the pretext of process alignment. During that call, I asked a hypothetical question. If an internal review begins narrowly but uncovers asymmetrical scrutiny across executive levels, what's best practice? There was a pause on the line. Best practice, she replied carefully, is consistency. Selective enforcement creates risk, not an accusation. Risk. Language matters. I thanked her and ended the call. Preparation isn't about gathering ammunition. It's about ensuring that when you speak, you cannot be dismissed as reactive. Meanwhile, the external audit of my trades continued. I cooperated fully, provided supplemental explanations, clarified portfolio mechanics. The auditors remained professional and neutral. One afternoon, one of them asked a question that caught my attention. Has there been any prior internal review of executive trades tied to this acquisition? The question was simple. It told me something. The lens was widening. I answered truthfully. Not to my knowledge, but I can provide prior review documentation for context. That evening, I compiled a packet. Not accusatory, not editorialized. Just precedent examples demonstrating how trade timing had been evaluated historically. I attached no commentary, just structure. What they never noticed was that I wasn't trying to prove Daniel guilty. I was proving that standards must apply uniformly. And if they didn't, the inconsistency itself became the issue. There is a difference between exposing someone and exposing an imbalance. One is personal, the other is systemic. I was not interested in destroying a career. I was interested in protecting the integrity of a process I had spent 9 years building. If my name was going to pass through scrutiny, so would the framework itself. Quietly, methodically, without accusation. Because once the right people saw the pattern, they would have to make a choice. And choices, under documentation, are harder to hide. By the end of that week, my file was no longer just a defense folder. It was a mirror, held steadily, waiting. The private reveal didn't come with a dramatic email. It came in the form of a calendar invite. Follow-up. Trade review findings. Attendees. External audit lead. Audit committee chair. Independent board member. Me. Not Daniel, not the CEO. That absence was the first signal. The meeting was scheduled for 7:30 a.m. before the official workday began. The kind of timing reserved for conversations that require discretion, not theatrics. I arrived 5 minutes early, sat at the smaller conference table, not the main boardroom, no panoramic skyline, just a muted wall and a single speakerphone. The audit lead began without preamble. We've completed our review of your personal trades, Maisie. His tone was steady, clinical. We found no evidence of discretionary timing or misuse of material non-public information. The allocation in question aligns with your documented automated investment schedule. He paused. We will be formally closing the inquiry related to your activity. There it was. Not an apology, not a congratulations, a closure. I nodded once. Thank you. Then he continued. However, during the course of the review, certain comparative data points raised additional questions. Comparative. I didn't move, didn't lean forward. He slid a packet across the table. Daniel's trades, the supplier company, the timeline expansion, 30 days prior to the acquisition, the modeling session dates, the incremental purchase pattern, nothing inflammatory, no bolded accusations, just alignment charts. The independent board member spoke next. These trades were pre-cleared under standard procedure, but the contextual exposure wasn't evaluated with the same rigor applied in your case. The audit committee chair added quietly, the asymmetry concerns us. That word again. Not guilt, not corruption. Asymmetry. I felt something then, but it wasn't triumph. It was stillness. Because the leverage I had quietly documented was now visible to people whose responsibility extended beyond daily executive politics. The audit lead looked at me directly. Did you have prior concerns about executive trade consistency? The question was careful. It was also an invitation. I chose my words precisely. My responsibility has always been to apply policy consistently. In this case, I observed a variance in scrutiny. I provided historical precedent documentation to ensure context. No accusation, no personal commentary, just facts. The board member exchanged a glance with the chair. We will be initiating a supplemental review specific to these trades, she said. Discreetly, meaning Daniel did not yet know. The private reveal wasn't that he was guilty, it was that the lens had shifted. For weeks, the focus had been narrow, centered on me. Now it had widened, and once widened, it could not easily be narrowed again without visible bias. As the meeting concluded, the audit committee chair lingered. Maisie, he said, softer now. You handled this with remarkable composure. I met his gaze evenly. I handled it with documentation. He gave a faint nod. When I walked back to my office, the building was just beginning to fill. Morning greetings, elevator chimes, the ordinary rhythm of a workday. Daniel passed me in the hallway. Morning, he said lightly. Morning, I replied. He had no idea that the structure supporting his confidence had just shifted beneath him, and I felt no urge to signal it, because leverage, when real, does not need to be displayed. It simply exists, quietly, waiting for the decision that follows. Once you know something that can change the trajectory of a room, the weight of it is different than being accused. Accusation is reactive. Knowledge is choice. After the private meeting, I returned to my office and closed the door, not out of secrecy, but to think without interruption. The audit had cleared me, officially. My name would no longer circulate in careful tones. The file attached to my reputation had been sealed. That alone would have been enough for many people. I could have stopped there, returned to work, accepted the quiet restoration, allowed the supplemental review of Daniel's trades to unfold independently, maintain my composure, and let the system correct itself. That was option one. Option two was more assertive. I could formally request a board-level review of trade scrutiny standards, not centered on Daniel specifically, but on structural inconsistency. It would be procedural, justified, and impossible to dismiss as personal retaliation. Option 3 was irreversible. I could step outside internal channels entirely, escalate concerns to regulators directly, not as an accusation, but as a disclosure of process irregularity. It would protect me permanently from internal politics. It would also fracture the company. I sat with each possibility carefully. The third option would feel dramatic to an outsider. Whistleblower narratives often do. But drama wasn't what I wanted. I wanted equilibrium. The second option appealed to my sense of order. It addressed asymmetry without targeting an individual. It would formalize what had already begun privately. But it would also signal something unmistakable. I was no longer willing to be quietly repositioned. I opened my notebook and wrote 3 headings: restore, reform, remove. Restore meant returning to normalcy. Reform meant changing the structure. Remove meant detonating the structure. Only one aligned with who I was. I had built 9 years of credibility on consistency. Escalating externally without exhausting internal governance mechanisms would contradict that foundation. But restoring normalcy without addressing the imbalance would ensure the pattern repeated. Perhaps not with me next time. That left reform. The irreversible part wasn't reporting Daniel. It was formalizing a systemic review that would inevitably encompass him. Once submitted, it could not be undone quietly. It would require documentation, minutes, and votes. It would be recorded. And records create permanence. That afternoon, I drafted a memo to the audit committee. Subject line: Proposal, Standardization of Executive Trade Review Protocol. The language was neutral. In light of recent review processes, I recommend implementing a uniform expanded review window for all executive trades tied to material corporate events. No names, no accusations, just structure. At the end of the memo, I included a simple sentence: Consistency is our strongest defense against perceived or actual impropriety. I read it 3 times, not for emotion, for alignment. Then I sent it directly to the audit committee chair and copied the independent board member. I did not copy Daniel. That was intentional. Within minutes, the chair responded. Received. Let's discuss at next week's committee session. Short, formal, unavoidable. The decision had been made. I had chosen reform. Not because I wanted consequences, but because silence, once strategic, becomes complicity if prolonged beyond necessity. I wasn't attacking. I was standardizing. And standardization, in environments built on selective comfort, is the most disruptive move of all. When I shut down my computer that evening, I felt something unfamiliar. Not relief, not anticipation, certainty. The path forward would no longer depend on private conversations. It would be written, documented, voted on. And once governance processes begin moving under scrutiny, even the most confident executives must answer questions they never expected to hear. Quietly, on record. The week between sending the memo and the audit committee session was outwardly ordinary. Earnings calls proceeded. Department heads presented forecasts. The CEO spoke confidently about strategic growth. Daniel delivered financial updates with his usual polish. Nothing looked unstable. That's the thing about structural shifts. They begin beneath the visible surface. I did not mention the memo to anyone. Not legal. Not to my team. Not even in a passing conversation. Silence, at this stage, wasn't defensive. It was containment. If governance was going to engage, it needed to do so without narrative interference. The moment something becomes gossip, it loses clarity. Instead, I focused on tightening internal compliance architecture. I scheduled a routine training refresh on insider trading policies for all officers, something we typically did annually. I moved it up by a quarter. The email invitation was neutral. Given recent review activity, it's a good opportunity to revisit best practices. Daniel replied within 10 minutes. Happy to participate. Of course he was. When you believe you're within policy, you welcome policy conversations. The training session was procedural. Slide deck, case studies, regulatory updates. But I added one new section: expanded context risk. Material non-public information, I explained to the room, isn't limited to finalized announcements. Modeling assumptions, supplier impact projections, and acquisition synergies can also shape market expectations. No one interrupted. Daniel's expression remained composed. I wasn't speaking to him. I was speaking to the minutes that would reflect that this training had occurred. Meanwhile, the audit committee met privately midweek, without me present. That was standard. Governance often deliberates before inviting executive commentary. Late Thursday afternoon, I received a brief calendar invite for the following Monday. Audit Committee, Trade Review Protocol Discussion. Attendees, Full Committee, External Counsel, me, Daniel. That inclusion was significant. He now knew something broader was under review, but he didn't yet know the shape of it. On Friday, Daniel stopped by my office again. The door remained open this time. I saw the committee session added to the calendar, he said casually. New protocol initiative? Yes, I replied evenly. Standardization discussion. He nodded slowly. Good. Clarity is always helpful. It was an innocuous exchange, but his eyes held something new. Calculation. He was aware that governance processes don't activate without stimulus, and he understood I had access. What he didn't know was that this wasn't a personal escalation. It was structural alignment. That distinction matters. Over the weekend, I reviewed my documentation one final time, not to strengthen it, but to ensure I wouldn't overstep. There is power in restraint when you hold leverage. Monday arrived quietly. The conference room was different this time, larger, formal, and recorded for official minutes. External counsel opened the session. The purpose today is to evaluate consistency in executive trade review protocols tied to material events. No names, no allegations, just framework. I presented historical precedent examples, redacted for privacy, focused on timing thresholds and review windows. Then the committee chair asked a question that shifted the air in the room. Daniel, can you walk us through the contextual considerations surrounding your Q2 supplier trades? It was measured, professional, unavoidable. Daniel straightened slightly. Certainly. They were part of a long-term portfolio strategy, pre-cleared in accordance with existing policy. The chair nodded. And were supplier impact projections discussed in acquisition modeling sessions prior to those trades? A pause. Brief. Controlled. Yes, Daniel answered. As part of broader financial analysis, the external counsel leaned in. Under an expanded contextual review window, those trades would trigger secondary evaluation. Not necessarily violation, but enhanced scrutiny. Silence followed. Not explosive. Just wait. Nothing was concluded that day. No accusations, no resolutions. But something irreversible had happened. The standard had shifted in real time. And once a standard expands, it cannot contract without visibility. I had moved in silence, and now governance was moving in daylight, quietly, on record. Consequences rarely announce themselves. They appear as adjustments. In the weeks following the audit committee session, the atmosphere shifted. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. Daniel's presence in meetings became slightly more measured. He spoke with the same confidence, but there was an added precision to his language, as if each word had been pre-screened before release. The expanded trade review protocol passed unanimously. On paper, it was procedural, a 30-day expanded review window tied to material corporate events, mandatory contextual disclosure, summaries for officers attending pre-announcement modeling sessions, independent secondary review for trades involving direct counterparties or suppliers. No one voted against it. No one framed it as disciplinary. It was simply good governance. But governance, once formalized, has gravity. Within days of the policy's adoption, the audit committee initiated retroactive application for trades connected to the recent acquisition. That included Daniel's. Again, no accusation, just consistency. I was not involved in the secondary review. That had been intentional. To avoid the appearance of conflict, the committee assigned oversight to external counsel and an independent advisor. Distance protects credibility. What followed was subtle. Daniel cancelled 2 investor lunches he had previously scheduled. He delegated portions of the next quarterly earnings preparation to his deputy. He began requesting that legal attend meetings he once handled alone. The CEO grew quieter in executive sessions, not toward me, just overall. There's a distinct tension when leadership realizes oversight has expanded beyond internal comfort. No one addressed the situation directly, but the energy of the room had changed. For the first time since the accusation against me, I felt neither scrutinized nor peripheral. I felt neutral, centered, because the focus was no longer personal. It was structural. One afternoon, a junior analyst stopped by my office hesitantly. "I just wanted to say," she began, lowering her voice, "the new policy makes sense. It feels fair." Fair. That word lingered. Not vindication, fairness. I thanked her and returned to my notes. A week later, the audit committee chair requested a brief one-on-one meeting. His tone was steady, but heavier than before. The secondary review identified disclosure gaps in contextual summaries tied to Daniel's supplier trades. He said, "Not an explicit violation, but insufficient transparency is given in modeling access." He paused. "We are discussing appropriate action." Appropriate action. Again, no dramatic language. I asked only one question. "Has the board been informed?" "Yes." That was enough. Consequences in corporate governance are rarely theatrical. They are reputational, structural, gradual. Daniel's authority wasn't stripped overnight, but it began to narrow. Financial strategy decisions now required documented joint review with legal and compliance. Investor communications were pre-screened more rigorously. The CEO began referencing strengthened oversight in public calls. No one connected these changes to me, not openly. And that was precisely the point. The system had corrected itself through its own mechanisms, not because I accused, but because I insisted on consistency. There's a quiet discomfort when someone realizes they have benefited from asymmetry. It's not anger, it's recalibration. I saw it in Daniel's posture during meetings. More contained, more careful, not defensive, just aware. Awareness is the beginning of consequence. And once awareness enters the room, nothing returns to its previous ease. The shift had begun, not explosive, not vindictive, just irreversible. Governance was now watching more closely. And when governance watches, power redistributes quietly. By the time the board scheduled the executive session, the outcome was already forming, quietly, behind closed doors. Executive sessions are different from regular meetings. No management present, no assistants, no operational updates, just directors, external counsel, and documentation. When leadership reaches that stage, the question is no longer whether something occurred. It's how to respond without destabilizing the company. Daniel must have known. He arrived earlier than usual that week, left later. His office door, once perpetually open, was now closed more often, not slammed, just shut. In meetings, he over-explained projections, volunteered additional detail, cited policy language before being asked. These are the behaviors of someone attempting to reinforce credibility. But credibility, once examined structurally, cannot be restored by enthusiasm. The external review concluded that while Daniel's trades did not meet the threshold for regulatory violation, the contextual disclosure omissions, combined with modeling session proximity, represented a governance failure in transparency. That phrase circulated quietly among board members. Governance failure. Not fraud, not a crime. Failure. It's a subtle but powerful distinction. Failure implies responsibility, and responsibility demands response. The board's decision was not theatrical. There was no emergency announcement, no press release framed around a scandal. Instead, a transition plan was drafted. Daniel would step back from direct oversight of acquisition related financial modeling. An interim review committee would supervise all future pre clearance approvals. And within the quarter, a strategic leadership realignment would be announced. Corporate language is a masterclass in containment. On a Thursday afternoon, the CEO called a brief executive meeting. His tone was calm. As part of our continued commitment to governance excellence, we'll be implementing additional structural safeguards. Daniel will transition into an advisory capacity while we evaluate long-term financial leadership alignment. Advisory capacity, a dignified phrase for diminished authority. No one asked questions in that meeting. No one looked at me directly. But the air had shifted again, this time heavier. Daniel spoke only once. I fully support the board's decision to prioritize governance clarity, he said evenly. His voice did not crack. His posture did not falter. But something had changed. The ease was gone. After the meeting, he passed by my office. He paused at the doorway. For what it's worth, he said carefully, this escalation feels disproportionate. There it was, not an accusation, not an apology, just recognition. I met his gaze without hostility. Consistency often feels disproportionate when it's new, I replied softly. He held my eyes for a moment longer, then nodded once and walked away. It wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't reconciliation. It was an acknowledgement. By the time the public announcement came weeks later, framed as a strategic financial leadership transition, the internal reality was already settled. The audit had cleared my name months earlier, but the real shift wasn't my exoneration. It was the standardization that followed. And once governance recalibrates under documented scrutiny, you cannot return to informal comfort. Too many minutes recorded, too many votes cast, too much visibility. The board had chosen stability over loyalty, structure over personality. And once that choice is made, it cannot be undone quietly. For Daniel, the path narrowed. For the company, oversight widened. For me, something else settled entirely. Not satisfied, not victory, just confirmation. Integrity, when documented patiently, does not need volume. It only needs light. And once light enters governance, shadows rearrange. Too late to fix, too early to pretend nothing shifted. The room would never feel the same again. Quietly, permanently. The final conversation happened on a grey afternoon, 2 days before the public leadership transition was announced. Daniel requested it, not through an assistant, directly. Do you have a few minutes? He asked from my doorway. His tone was steady, almost reflective. I closed my notebook and gestured to the chair across from me. He sat down slowly. No defensive posture, no visible tension, just fatigue around the edges. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, I underestimated you. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't bitter. It was factual. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let the silence settle. Not as a strategy this time, but as space. In what way? I asked calmly. He exhaled quietly. I assumed you would focus solely on clearing your name. I didn't anticipate structural escalation. Structural escalation. The phrasing almost made me smile. I didn't escalate, I said evenly. I standardized. He looked at me for a long moment. That's a matter of perspective. No, I replied gently. It's a matter of documentation. There was no anger in my voice, no triumph, just precision. He leaned back slightly, considering that. I didn't intend for your review to become personal, he said. It was risk management. That word again, risk. And asymmetry is a form of risk, I answered. He nodded once, slowly. I see that now. There was no apology, but there was acknowledgement, which, in corporate environments, is often the closest thing you receive. After a pause, he asked a question that surprised me. Did you ever consider going outside the company? He wasn't accusing, he was assessing. Yes, I said honestly. I considered all governance pathways. And you chose internal reform. Yes. Why? Because this was the company I had helped build. Because governance deserves the opportunity to correct itself before being exposed. Because integrity isn't about destruction. But I simplified it. Because consistency protects everyone, even you. I didn't say that part. He studied me carefully. You could have made this louder. Yes, another silence. Then he stood. I suppose, he said quietly, this is what quiet power looks like. I didn't answer. Because power wasn't the point. Stability was. As he reached the door, he paused. For what it's worth, your composure forced the board to take you seriously. I considered that. It wasn't composure, I said softly. It was patience. He gave a small nod and left. The door closed gently behind him. There was no explosion, no raised voices, no dramatic vindication. Just two professionals acknowledging that standards, once formalized, changed the room permanently. When I returned to my desk, I didn't feel victorious. I felt aligned. There's a difference between winning and being steady. Winning depends on comparison. Steadiness depends on self-trust. The confrontation had no heat because it didn't need it. The work had already been done. Documentation had spoken. Governance had responded. And the narrative that once framed me as a liability had dissolved without a single public argument. That's the thing about quiet dominance. It doesn't humiliate. It recalibrates without spectacle, without cruelty, just clarity. And clarity, once shared, cannot be withdrawn. The months after Daniel's transition were quieter than I expected. No celebration, no whispered congratulations, no dramatic shift in how people greeted me in the hallway. What changed wasn't volume, it was positioning. For the first time in 9 years, I was invited into strategy discussions at the beginning, not at the compliance checkpoint near the end. Not because I demanded it, because governance now required it. That distinction matters. The new CFO, appointed after a national search, scheduled a meeting with me during his first week. I want compliance integrated early, he said plainly. Not as a safeguard, but as a strategic partner. I nodded. I had heard variations of that sentence before, but this time, the follow-through was visible. Draft models crossed my desk before projections were finalized. Risk exposure conversations included me in brainstorming, not as an afterthought. I didn't speak anymore. I didn't change my tone, but when I asked questions now, they were treated as structural input, not procedural resistance. The difference wasn't in my voice, it was in their perception. And perception, I've learned, shifts when you prove that silence is not absence. It's calibration. Personally, something else had settled inside me. For years, I believed professionalism meant absorbing discomfort quietly. That composure required a shrinking emotional response to preserve stability. Now I understand something more precise. Restraint is powerful only when it's chosen. When restraint is imposed, by culture, by dismissal, by fear of being labeled difficult, it erodes self-trust. What changed wasn't that I became louder. It's that I stopped normalizing subtle disrespect. If a meeting excludes compliance from material discussion, I correct it. Calmly. If documentation standards appear uneven, I address them. Immediately. Not defensively. Just clearly. I no longer assume neutrality protects me. Neutrality, without boundaries, invites imbalance. The black leather notebook still sits beside me in every meeting, but I no longer sit at the edge of the table unless the table is physically full. I choose my seat deliberately now. That's not symbolism, it's awareness. Daniel's departure wasn't spoken of often. The public narrative framed it as a strategic transition. Internally, it became a quiet case study in governance training. Not about him, about the process, about consistency. And that's how I wanted it. No bitterness lingers, no quiet scorekeeping. Because this was never about proving someone wrong. It was about ensuring the system could not selectively apply its lens. I'm still calm, still measured, still patient, but I am no longer willing to be assigned invisibility. There's a difference between being underestimated and accepting underestimation. One is perception, the other is participation. I no longer participate in that version of myself. Integrity, I've learned, isn't proven when you're comfortable. It's proven when you're scrutinized. And once you pass through scrutiny without flinching, while insisting the same light applies everywhere, you don't need to announce your strength. People adjust to it, quietly, over time. That's who I am now. Not louder, just unambiguous. About my standards, about my boundaries, about the weight of documentation in rooms that once mistook patience for weakness. And once you become unambiguous, the room rearranges itself accordingly, without you raising your voice. Not once. If you've stayed with me this long, you might be expecting a sharper ending, a dramatic reveal, a triumphant line, some declaration of victory. But realignment rarely feels triumphant. It feels quiet. When the audit cleared my name, there was no applause. When governance widened its lens, there was no public reckoning. When leadership shifted, there was no spectacle. There was only documentation, consistency, and time. What this experience taught me is something I wish more professionals understood earlier. You don't have to shout to correct a narrative. You don't have to humiliate someone to hold them accountable. And you don't have to abandon your composure to prove your strength. But you do have to decide when silence stops being dignity and starts becoming permission. For years, I believed that staying neutral kept me safe. That if I worked hard enough, documented carefully enough, and avoided politics long enough, integrity would be self-evident. Integrity is not self-evident. It must be defended, not emotionally, structurally. When I handed over my personal bank records, I wasn't being dramatic. I was being deliberate. Transparency removed doubt from me, and standardization removed imbalance from the system. That's the part people don't talk about enough. Quiet dominance isn't about revenge. It's about alignment. It's about letting scrutiny sharpen you instead of shrinking you. It's about widening the lens, calmly, until fairness becomes unavoidable. I didn't win. The system corrected itself, and I chose not to step aside while it did. So if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever felt the subtle shift of being repositioned without confrontation, if you've ever watched standards applied unevenly and wondered whether speaking up would cost you more than staying silent, ask yourself this: are you staying quiet because it's strategic, or because you've been conditioned to accept less visibility than you deserve? I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced a moment where your calm was mistaken for weakness? And how did you respond?